And now, knowing your customer has become more important for financial companies than it has ever been before. The rise of multinationals, increased globalization driven by tech, and increasingly stringent fines has made that an imperative. The responsibility for combating fraud and financial crime is increasingly diffuse, with multiple actors playing significant roles. Here to talk us through how to fight fraud is Executive Chairman of World Remit, Ismail Ahmed, Director of Product Management of Google, Mark Risher, in conversation with Der Spiegel's Marcel Rosenbach. Gentlemen, please join us.
A very good late morning, everybody here at MoneyConf. We're going to be talking how to best combat evil with technology. But before we do that, I thought it would be a good idea to introduce Ismail a little bit with his fascinating life story. At least I was fascinated to hear it, and it makes a perfect connection to our topic, because you were a heavy user of remittance services in your youth, right? You studied in the UK, sent money. You had to travel to agents. They would take a heavy cut of the money you sent. It took you time to travel there. And fast forward, later on, you yourself built a remittance program and then discovered fraud. That was to say, with the UN, right? You built this program and you discovered fraud within that program, got a reward as a whistleblower for discovering that, and built your own company with parts of the reward, or the whole reward. So that's really interesting, I thought, and it gives you a complete perspective on the topic, I think. And we're not here to discuss success stories, right? But how to tackle fraud, money laundering, and terrorist financing in new digital payment services. Perhaps you could give us an impression of the scope of the problem at first.
I think the problem we face is that a lot of the regulatory, a lot of the regulations are based on the historic KYC, know your customer. But increasingly we live in because of digitization in the 21st century, you don't want customers or users to go to a location to go through KYC. So electronic KYC offers a lot of benefits to technology businesses, to financial services, because it means you can do customer due diligence seamlessly and real time. And it benefits the customers because you don't have to travel, as I used to do when I used to send money back home. It is cheaper for companies because you don't have to hire a lot of agents to do the KYC. And most importantly, it means you can use the data you capture. You capture first a lot more data to fight fraud, and in the case of financial services, to actually better comply with the tough new regulatory requirements. And I think that is what the electronic KYC helps us do. And in the case of World Remit, we send remittance from 50 countries to about 150 countries. And very early on, the company is 8 years old, we had to learn and battle, argue with regulators about the fact that electronic KYC is far superior to somebody visiting a shop and saying that this is who I am, because of the amount of information we capture. And then I think, and then finally, that information you capture when you do electronic KYC helps us to minimize friction, minimize false positives. And what is a false positive in the case of for us, screening customers against sanction lists, because sanctions violation is a criminal offense. So for us, it's not about the risk of losing money if a fraudster uses our service. It's about if the wrong guy uses our service, it could be quite challenging. And so what do we mean by false positive? It means that your name match against somebody who is already on a sanction list.
You personally have a problem with that, right?
Yes, so I shared both of my names with the former spiritual leader of the Palestinian group Hamas, who was killed 14 years ago. But the American authorities decided to keep his name on the sanction list just in case. And so the screening software often comes up with 100% match. In other words, confirming that this is the person. And so that is a false positive. And when I used to send money back home, that was a challenge I always faced. And that means friction for the customer. So what AI now helps us to do is that historically, it was a compliance officer who would review that transaction, leave a detailed note as to why I am not the guy on the sanction list. But nowadays, AI, machine learning can help us and actually do a better job and match my picture details against the former spiritual leader of Hamas, who was on a wheelchair, partially blind, and some of the database we have got enhanced data, which is not an offer, and a machine could do a better job rather than somebody who is half asleep could confuse my picture with that one of
a machine can do a better job, but one of the challenges with AI is also machine learning bias and the fact that the algorithm can only be as smart as what it was trained upon. And so you're right that it could identify that you're not blind or deceased, but if it's been trained on a simple or very basic training corpus, it could miss that. So one thing we've looked at is how do you balance the best of human intelligence with the best of machine intelligence.
So who in the audience has some kind of Google account? Google Mail, YouTube? I would think almost everybody.
We also have a search
so
product
here's the guy. Here's the guy in charge of all that. His Twitter bio says all things Google accounts. So if you want to complain, please later on.
Yeah,
we want to ask you perhaps first, what kind of new attack vectors do you see? I mean, we've all read about some vulnerabilities in latest weeks and months.
Yeah.
But what kind of new attack vectors do you see, and how is Google using machine learning or artificial intelligence to fight those?
Well, one real common trend that we're seeing from attacks is that they're becoming much more specialized and targeted. In the past, messages would do this sort of see what works, and they would send a very generic, dear sir or madam, I'm writing from your bank account that's been suspended. Please confirm all of your details. And that very generic approach had a quite low success rate. Now what we see is that people send something that's precision guided and targeted. It says, maybe it's done some research about you online, and add some geographic information, some biographic information to be much more convincing and have a much higher success rate. Here we are in MoneyConf. One area that people are being targeted is for bragging about or talking about cryptocurrency, because it can be so easy to steal something that's purely digital. And so the attackers have realized that targeting one high-worth individual is much more effective and much better strategy than just spraying it generically.
Yeah. So you're talking about spear phishing attacks and what that could mean. We saw with John Podesta's Gmail account, right, in the US election. That was such a case, right?
Spear phishing is a general trend, and it's proving to be quite effective. In fact, it's what led to us creating a product specifically around that. This advanced protection program, which we rolled out about a year ago, is designed for people that have either higher likelihood or higher impact should their accounts be taken over. And this is not just Gmail email messages, but also we were talking in the wings about Google Pay and Google Photos and Google Drive, many different services, as well as the linked services from other companies around the web.
Okay, and I need a piece of hardware for that, right?
Oh, that's true. Yeah, so that's
you
my
brought,
prop.
by accident, you brought one.
By coincidence, yeah, exactly.
It's a dongle, right? A piece of hardware you have to carry with you?
Yeah, one of the requirements for advanced protection is that we have this physical security key, which is, there's a few form factors in this box, but it's something that must be physically in your control when you're setting up a new device, a new computer, a new phone, etc. And the reason for that is that it dramatically changes the security properties. It moves you from a place where really anyone around the world could potentially be guessing your password or trying to circumvent other challenges to something where they must have physical proximity and control of something that, this one looks like a USB thumb drive. This other version has Bluetooth and NFC, so it works wirelessly with your Android or iPhone. That physical proximity dramatically reduces from 7 billion potential attackers to really right now the two of you sitting on this couch.
Okay, I promise I will not.
Thank you.
At least.
I think the future is the digital identities. Digital identities which could be used for technology businesses, for financial services, and I think there is a lot we could learn from the developing countries, which are now leapfrogging again, like mobile money, into building digital identities linked to your phone. Kind of, your phone number becomes your your account number, your digital ID, and so on. And look at how in India, 1 billion people who historically were mostly had no identities, have now got a digital identity. So, and I think if technology companies, if financial service companies, if banks are using the same digital identity, it means I think we could solve a lot of problems. Problems related to the fake news, the foreign governments kind of interfering elections and so on. Because I think technology companies, Facebook, Google, can learn a lot from financial service companies who've now understand how could you really verify the identity of your customer when you onboard them. I think if you do that, there's a less risk of somebody doing impersonations, kind of using somebody else's identity, and so on and so forth. So I think that I believe is the future. And I think financial services, because of the hefty fines we face if we violate sanctions and so on, have done and invested a lot more than technology companies who are not regulated companies.
I was with you until the part about fake news, because I think that certainly digital identity opens up the marketplace. It's lower friction. It's something, Aadhaar is fascinating in India. There are still, though, anonymous circumstances on the web, or places where you may not want to tie it back, as well as places where binding something to yourself may not actually reduce the chances that it's deceitful or that it's dishonest. So I think that these need to be looked at separately. One of them is an authentication. It is, are you who you say you are? But then that's not just a single point in time. That is continuous, and we can go back to, KYC is not just at sign-up time, but also then, after that authentication moment, there still is a lot of behavioral analytics of what is the person doing with this identity, what are the transactions that they're engaging with, and is that something that both matches the patterns we expect for that individual, as well as the norms on the platform or the surface that we're interacting with.
I think one challenge globally we have is that in terms of anti-money laundering, we have a global standard setter, which is the Financial Action Task Force. In the case of identities, and particularly increasingly digital identities, we don't have agreed kind of international regulations. It's something which says that here is what we should follow. And one of the biggest challenges we faced in the early days of our business was that a lot of the way regulations were interpreted meant that everything was favoring face-to-face KYC.
Right.
And I mean, take the case of Canada. Until recently, we were required to do full KYC, which means search somebody's credit file, ask them a photo ID, bank statement. If somebody did $1,000, every time they do a subsequent transaction, the way the regulation was interpreted at the time was that you could not, it is not possible to identify this is the same customer, although the customer is using the same email, connected to the same recipient, we have their card details, their bank account, and so on. It was only recently that was changed. So in the first 5 years in our business in Canada, we're only doing less than $1,000 transactions because it was just impossible.
Right.
We could not ask us to email back statement every time. That is changing now, and look at even some of the countries in Africa which are exploring how we can do electronic KYC. In Malaysia, we were the first international money transfer company that was given a sandbox license to trial electronic KYC. So increasingly governments are recognize the benefits of digital KYC, but there are no international standards of how we could
There's
go.
no standards, and also there's some human factors concerns that are really fascinating, because while you can have this durable, cryptographically backed identity on your phone, if you leave that phone here on the sofa, it's a white sofa, it might blend in. How do you recover that? How do you get back to it is a really difficult challenge. Something we've invested in because obviously Google is predominantly digital. So how do we get people back into their accounts? How do we ensure that they can recover if they lose their device, while at the same time remaining robust against attacks and strangers that might be coming into it?
Sure.
There aren't these norms yet in the digital world, so that's an interesting space.
But there are some norms, and as we are in Europe, we have GDPR since the end of May, and it's perfectly understandable from your perspective that you want to know as much about your customers as possible. On the other hand, we have this really strict privacy regulation now in Europe. How do we reconcile that? How big an effort it was for your company?
Yeah.
Well, I think the GDPR does not prevent us from knowing our customer. I think the more data we capture, of course, we need their consent. They need to be aware of what we are doing with the data. But the more data we capture, the more we're able to tell who is impersonating somebody else. And I think this is now possible because we could tell a fraudster even as soon as they go through a couple of pages, because a regular customer sending money to Philippines behaves a certain way compared to somebody who's trying a stolen card. So that information we capture seamlessly while somebody is using our service enables us to connect the rest of the data we have and make quick decisions, which means we don't inconvenience or create friction for genuine customers. Because here, in the case of our business, probably as much as 20-30% of our transactions are super urgent. Some are actually life and death situations. We see customers sending money to a family member who had a stroke and needs to go to hospital within an hour. And if they don't receive the $100 they're sending, that person would not be seen by a doctor. So sometimes we have to challenge. And this is where AI, I think the machine learning, the amount of data, understanding the behavior of customers helps us to differentiate bad guys from the genuine customers.
But that is one area where, so GDPR was a huge investment for our company. It was one of the biggest initiatives over the last few years, and we obviously take user privacy incredibly seriously. There are some tensions, though, in building that AI model and in retaining that considerable history to be able to do security while at the same time be transparent to users and give them the right to expunge information. So, for example, the best way to provide that, that very fast, I need to get to my money so that I can pay for a medical issue, is by comparing that transaction against the history. But to the degree at which we're not able to retain a history, or it's limited to just 1 month or 2 months worth of data, it can get in the way of that. And that's one of the unintended consequences that we really want to work together to ensure it doesn't become ritualized.
I think that's quite interesting. Yes, I think technology companies are not required to keep that data. For us, AML regulations mean across countries. In most countries, we have to keep that data for 5 years, even when they when they end their relationship. In some markets, up to 10 years.
Yeah.
So for us, we are required to maintain that data, and it is one of that's data which helps us to track, easily tell what is happening, connect your historical transactions to what you're currently doing.
So that's one of the areas we've invested from the AI standpoint, is then how do you balance these two? You're right, in a regulated industry, you have this considerable history. Yeah. Do you purely train off of the past, or how can you kind of push forward? And one thing we've invested in recently is what we call human in the loop from an artificial intelligence standpoint, really leveraging the best of machines and the best of people. Your personal story was you identifying just by sight some fraud patterns and then being able to dig in and investigate. And we want to really capture that expertise and leverage it through the use of artificial intelligence. And so that's been really powerful for us.
Perhaps it would be interesting to learn a little bit more, because, everybody's talking about AI here at Web Summit. I don't know how many panels are on AI.
Yeah.
It's the buzzword, one of the buzzwords of the moment. Perhaps you can try to explain to us the secret sauce, right? What its behavioral patterns, its transactional structures, what makes the algorithms aware that there might be something wrong. Do you have some more examples?
Sure. I mean, the general use of artificial intelligence, you're right, it's buzzwordy, and some people say it's really just statistics, because what you're doing is you're looking at and generalizing over a pattern of what you've seen before, and using that to extrapolate towards what's good and what's bad in the future. And the way that this works is tremendously powerful in that you can look at many, many different signals across a very wide feature vector to find these subtle patterns. However, there are challenges too. One thing you frequently sacrifice in a pure AI model is explainability. When I write a rule, when you were doing manual fraud, you say, here's why this looks weird. Like I see the exact same amount used on 5 successive days. That seems very suspicious. But your AI model will very seldom give you explainability. It will instead say, this transaction was flagged because it's 4,000 units from the decision boundary in a multi-spatial hypercube. And that doesn't really give you any confidence of whether it's a good or bad idea. So that's, again, why we've been investing recently in, you can't necessarily explain what happened within the box, but you can do through principal component analysis or through various algorithmic techniques, have the model also spit out a justification, if you will, and say, here's something that makes sense to a human being for why I caught this, and again, put that in the loop with an expert who can say, that's a stupid rule, or that's a great rule, and kind of build from there.
Do you also think there will always have to be a man in the loop, or a human in the loop, not a man, a human in the loop?
I think what we've seen is that, when the data piece is somebody's reviewing, it's a single data point, couple, it's possible, it's easier for an agent, for a compliance officer to make, a transaction monitoring agent to make a decision and say, I think this looks like this. But when you capture hundreds of pieces of data, then sometimes even a compliance officer could make a decision, but the decision assisted by a score which says,
absolutely,
here's what's happening. And I think when we look at our history, we see, I think as the amount of data we capture becomes more complex, of course, I think it becomes something which an individual cannot comprehend, can solve.
Precisely.
So that's where really machine learning is making a huge difference. And we can now see stuff we used to, when somebody was reviewing a flagged transaction, which was quite challenging now. Yeah. Now, I think with machine learning, with scoring, we can say, hey, this is based on all of these. And you can see the difference. We compare that to our historical data and say, and now that's where we'll make a lot of difference.
And do it instantaneously.
Yeah.
I mean, a Swift transaction takes, like 3 to 5 business days while multiple people are reading through the file versus microseconds for this classification. So it's obviously inevitable. What we want to do is just ensure that these models really understand the person behind it and that they are not biased, that they're not trained off of skewed data, which then leads to bad decisions, and that they then have that explainability.
And I think that progress now, and the fact that even our recipients have smartphones now means in financial services, historically, banks used to only focus on their senders, but not the person who receives remittances or the international transactions. Now, increasingly, some regulators are looking at an idea where financial service companies would be forced to even KYC the recipients.
Yeah, on both ends.
Because it's possible now. It wasn't possible in the past.
Yeah.
Okay. You know the customers. I know the clock. Time is running out. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. Thank you, Ismail, and thank you, Mark.
My pleasure.
And enjoy the rest of Web Summit.